There's a case out of Ocean Springs, Mississippi that keeps getting stranger the closer you look at it. And today we're laying out exactly why so many people online refuse to let this one go. Nolan Wells disappeared after a trip to Horn Island over the July 4th weekend. He was last seen with two friends, who we'll refer to here as Warren and Jax, the two people closest to him on that trip, and the two people whose accounts of what happened have drawn the most scrutiny since. Here's what's actually confirmed. Nolan never made it back from that island. His body was recovered later, and the working theory floated early on, that he'd been drinking heavily and drowned, became the accepted narrative almost immediately. No formal charges have been filed against anyone. No one has been arrested. And that, more than anything else, is what's fueling the online firestorm. The questions aren't really about whether Warren and Jax did something. Nobody watching this case from the outside claims to know that. The questions are about process, about why certain basic investigative steps don't appear to have been taken, at least not publicly. Multiple true crime commentators have pointed to the same pattern. In comparable disappearance and death investigations elsewhere in the country, the people last seen with the victim are almost always treated as points of interest, even when no one suspects them of anything. That's not about guilt. That's standard procedure. Phones get imaged. Boats get processed for forensic evidence. Clothing gets collected and tested. It's the kind of routine, protective step that clears innocent people just as often as it implicates guilty ones, which is exactly why its apparent absence here has raised eyebrows. Commentators online have drawn comparisons to other well-known cases where the last people to see a missing or deceased person were held or questioned, not because they were automatically presumed guilty, but because that's how these investigations typically move. In one frequently cited example, a young mother was taken into custody within a day of reporting her child missing, not for the disappearance itself, but for inconsistencies in her account. In another, a man was held for nearly a week purely on a charge of misleading investigators, long before anyone knew what had actually happened to the person he was connected to. In a third, a mother sat in custody for months before her children were even located, on similar grounds. None of those early holds were convictions. They were procedural, a way of preserving evidence and accounts before memories fade, stories get coordinated, or physical evidence degrades. That's the baseline commentators are measuring Nolan's case against. And it's why the absence of any comparable step here keeps coming up. When that step seems to be skipped, people start asking why, and in the absence of an answer, they tend to fill the gap with their own theories, which is exactly what's happening across true crime spaces right now. It's worth saying plainly, skipped procedure doesn't prove wrongdoing. Investigations vary case to case, jurisdiction to jurisdiction, and there are legitimate reasons a department might sequence its work differently than the public expects. But when a case draws this much attention, the absence of an explanation becomes its own story, and that's largely what's happened here. One detail that's been circulating heavily: reports that Nolan's keys and phone were recovered not on the island, not in the water, but reportedly inside a residence connected to one of his friends. If accurate, that's the kind of detail that, in most jurisdictions, would trigger a closer procedural look, not an accusation, but a routine follow-up. So far, there's no public indication that's happened, and that gap between what a normal investigation would look like and what's been shared publicly is the entire engine driving this story online. Nolan's mother and her supporters have been vocal about one specific request: release the evidence. If the official theory, that this was an accidental drowning with no foul play, is supported by the autopsy, the toxicology, the forensic testing on the boat and the residence, then releasing that information publicly would, in theory, end most of the speculation overnight. Instead, that information has largely stayed behind closed doors. Dr. Stacey Turner, the state medical examiner overseeing the case, has reportedly sought to retain certain organs and tissue before Nolan's body is transferred out of state for an independent, family-requested autopsy, a request the family and their supporters have characterized as an unnecessary complication, though officials have described it as standard forensic protocol. Whichever framing is accurate, the optics haven't helped. Every additional delay, every piece of unreleased information, adds fuel to a narrative that something is being managed rather than investigated. Local officials, including Sheriff John Ledbetter, have said publicly that the investigation is ongoing and won't be rushed to satisfy a timetable set by the family or the internet. That's a defensible position on its face. Investigations do take time, and pressure from social media isn't a substitute for evidence. But it's also exactly the kind of statement that, without accompanying transparency, reads very differently to an audience that's already skeptical. Judge Ashley Cole, whose son has reportedly been named in online discussion of the case, has also drawn attention, not for anything she's ruled on, since she has no formal role in adjudicating this matter, but simply for the public statements she's made asserting her son's innocence while the investigation is still active. Whether that's a mother defending her child or a public figure overstepping her position depends entirely on who you ask, but it's added another layer of scrutiny to an already tense situation. None of this proves a cover-up. Bureaucratic caution, forensic protocol, and legitimate legal concerns can all produce the same outward appearance as deliberate obstruction. That's part of what makes cases like this so hard to read from the outside. But the family's request has remained consistent and simple throughout. If the evidence supports the official theory, release it. So far, that hasn't happened, and until it does, the gap between nothing to hide and nothing has been shown is going to keep getting filled with speculation. Adding another layer to this story, a friend connected to Nolan, identified online as Eric Alcantara, reportedly reshared a social media post joking about doing something that could carry a 10-year prison sentence. According to multiple accounts, the post was shared, then deleted, and Eric's account was subsequently set to private. To be clear about what we actually know here, it was a repost of a meme-style joke, not a confession, not a direct statement about the case, and there's no confirmed link between the post and Nolan's disappearance. But the timing, during an active, high-profile investigation into the death of someone he's connected to, is why it spread as fast as it did. Whether it means anything at all is genuinely unclear. What's not unclear is that deleting a post and locking down an account during a case like this is going to get noticed and talked about, fairly or not. It's a pattern true crime audiences have seen before in other cases. A piece of digital activity that's probably meaningless on its own gets amplified because of the context surrounding it. Screenshots get archived before deletion. Timestamps get cross-checked. Account histories get picked apart. Sometimes that scrutiny turns up something real. More often, it turns out to be exactly what it looked like. Bad judgment, bad timing, and nothing more. Right now, there's no way to know which category this falls into, and anyone telling you otherwise is speculating same as everyone else. What it has done, regardless of what it actually means, is keep Eric's name circulating alongside Warren's and Jax's in online discussion of the case, fairly or not, and without any of them having been charged with anything. Part of what's kept this story alive isn't just the specifics of Nolan's case. It's a broader, recurring frustration a lot of true crime audiences have with how disappearance and death investigations get handled differently depending on where they happen, who's involved, and how much public pressure builds around them. That frustration isn't unique to Mississippi, and it isn't new. But it does explain why a case with this many unanswered procedural questions has generated this much sustained attention rather than fading after a few news cycles. There's also a simpler, more human reason this case has stuck around. The family has been persistent, publicly and repeatedly asking for transparency, and every time that request goes unanswered, it reads as confirmation to an already skeptical audience that something isn't adding up. As of now, no arrests, no formal charges, no public release of forensic findings from the boat, the residence, or the phones involved. The independent, family-requested autopsy is reportedly moving forward, which could bring new information, or could simply confirm the original drowning theory and answer very little about the process questions that have dominated this conversation. What we don't know still outweighs what we do. We don't know what, if anything, the phones or the boat would show if tested. We don't know why the keys ended up where they reportedly did. We don't know what's actually in the sealed reports Dr. Turner's office is holding, or whether releasing them would clear everyone involved or complicate things further. And we don't know whether Eric's post means anything beyond bad timing and worse judgment. What we do know is that a mother is still waiting for answers about her son, that the people closest to him that day have not been formally cleared or charged, and that every unanswered procedural question keeps this story in front of a national audience that isn't going anywhere until something changes. Cases like this tend to resolve in one of two ways. Either new evidence eventually forces a formal step, an arrest, a charge, a public statement that closes the loop, or the silence simply continues long enough that public attention moves on, leaving the family with an official ruling they never fully accept. Which direction Nolan Wells' case goes likely depends less on public pressure than most people assume, and more on what's actually sitting in those unreleased files. The frustrating truth is that outside observers, no matter how many procedural gaps they point to, don't get to decide that. Only the people holding the evidence do. We'll keep following this one as it develops. Let us know in the comments what you think is actually going on here, and what you'd want to see released publicly before this case gets any kind of real resolution.